Hello and welcome to Miss Dotson's Anatomy and Physiology course. This was recorded during the COVID-19 pandemic, and so it is an introduction to basically everything that anatomy is going to be like in the anatomy course. And with chapter 1, it's just terms that you're going to see throughout the entire unit. It's understanding different body terms, it's understanding different processes. So chapter 1, as it says here, is just an orientation. It's just going to give you an idea of some common themes that we're going to use throughout the anatomy and physiology course. So the first thing, one of my favorite things that I say over and over and over again is structure determines function. You'll hear me say SDF, structure determines function. The structure of something determines its job. And so, for example, we talk about, cars and bicycles. They have two different structures. And even though they're both used for movement, they're going to move in different ways. So they have different jobs. So whenever we talk about the structure of something, that's what we're talking about, the anatomy. When we're talking about its function, how it actually works, that's what we're talking about when we talk about physiology. So you can't have anatomy without physiology and vice versa. So whenever we talk about the parts of something, like the parts of the kidney, we'll talk about the renal pelvis, we'll talk about the renal medulla. The parts will be the anatomy. When we talk about how the kidney actually filters out the urea from your bloodstream and makes urea, that's going to be physiology. So just some common themes you'll see throughout the year. Whenever somebody or you hear something talked about with gross anatomy is also called systemic anatomy, and that's what I tend to teach. Because with gross anatomy or systemic anatomy, you're looking at the systems. So you're looking at the larger body structures altogether. So for example, we'll do the skeletal system. We'll do all the bones together. We'll do the muscular system. We'll do all the muscles together. That's what we call gross anatomy or systemic anatomy. Now, sometimes we might have to do something that's called regional anatomy. And regional anatomy is just what the name says. It's all the parts of a specific region. So if you go on to med school, nursing school, EMT school, you'll probably have to do some regional anatomy, which is a little bit more complex. Because regional anatomy would be like me giving you an arm. And you had to dissect the arm and look at all the systems in the arm. So the integumentary system is the skin and membranes. Then you'd have to know the nervous system, which are all the nerves that go to the arm. Then you have to know the cardiovascular system, which are all the blood vessels that go to the arm. So regional anatomy is a little bit more complicated. Developmental and embryology kind of go hand in hand. This is where you study how the anatomy of the body develops. And so it's structural changes over time and developmental changes that occur before birth. We'll spend most of our time, like I said, doing what's called gross anatomy. It's also called systemic anatomy because we're studying the body systems. When we look at physiology, we're going to be looking at how these things work, how the structure of them causes them to have a certain job, SDF. And so root words are going to be real important in this course. Lots and lots and lots of vocab, lots of vocab. And so one of the things that I always stress to my students, we have trained you throughout elementary school and middle school to study for vocab. And when you study vocab, you tend to use flashcards or Quizlets or something. But a lot of times somebody gives you the word and you have to spit out the definition. Well, you're going to find that on my assessments, very rarely do I ask you to define something. A lot of times I'll give you the definition in like a matching or a short answer or a multiple choice, and you have to come up with the word. And it's amazing how the brains of teenagers sometimes have a hard time making that switch. So when you're studying vocab, make sure that you kind of what I call flip-flopping. Like I said, throughout elementary school and middle school, you probably, like somebody would yell out regional, and you would say all the body parts of a specific region. But like I said, on your assessments, very rarely you're going to be asked to define a word. So you need to flip-flop it when you're studying your vocab. Make sure you study the vocab word, of the vocab definition, and you're able to spit out the word. And so we're going to be dealing with root words because there's going to be lots of vocab, and it just might get to the point where you see a word and it does not make sense to you. But if you can break it down into its root words, it's going to help you. So you guys grew up talking about what's called the circulatory system, which you guys know is the heart, the blood, and blood vessels. Well, it's not called the circulatory system anymore. It's called the cardiovascular system, because the root word cardio is referring to your heart, and vascular refers to your blood vessels. Anytime you see renal, for example, that's going to have something to do with the kidneys. Obviously, reproductive has to do with reproduction and the production of offspring. And the neurophysiology, again, when you see neuro, that lets you know that you are dealing with something with your nervous system. Now, there are a few very generic things that we have to start off with anatomy. And I always say the first part of anatomy is the hardest because we have to build. Remember, structure determines function. You can't put a car together unless you know how the different parts work and how the different parts belong to the big picture. So we have to start small. So you're going to see with this course, we're going to start off talking about just some basic chemistry. What's an atom? What's an element? How do atoms work together to make molecules? How do molecules work together in order for the cell to work properly? So we are going to have to start fairly small. So we will begin with atoms and molecules in the chemistry unit. We'll talk about the parts of the cell again, because obviously, if structure determines function, you have different cells in your body. And your nerve cells work differently from your muscle cells. So there's something about their structure that's different. And the organelles, how the organelles inside of them work. And we'll also talk about the shapes of cells, because something like a red blood cell looks like a little boat, looks like a little basket, it's going to carry things. While something like a nerve cell, which is called a neuron, looks like a kite. It's an antenna in order to gather information. And then we'll move into how cells come together to form the 4 types of tissues in your body. And after we get to the tissues, we can actually start talking about the organs and the organ system. So the first part of anatomy is going to be a little bit more difficult, simply because it's small molecular stuff. And it's a little bit harder to visualize it through virtual learning as opposed to the classroom. But we are going to talk about atoms, which atoms are the smallest units of matter that have characteristics. So a lot of times atoms and elements go hand in hand. So if you think of atoms as having addresses. So if an atom has an address of 2, 2, and 2, which means it has 2 neutrons, 2 electrons, and 2 protons. That's helium. It's going to give it a specific address, and it has a certain shape. So I always talk about Legos. So if something like helium has 2 protons, 2 electrons, and 2 neutrons, so that's like having 2 green Legos, 2 yellow Legos, and 2 blue Legos. And I can only build so much with 6 Legos. But as I add protons, neutrons, and electrons, like by the time I get to carbon, carbon is 6, 6, 6. 6 protons, 6 electrons, 6 neutrons. That's, 18 Legos that I can build something with. So the more protons, neutrons, and electrons an atom has, the more complex that atom becomes. And that's what makes all of our elements different. We'll talk more about that later. We then move to molecules. We're going to talk about the 4 most important molecules we have in our body. We're going to talk about carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And they're always talked about in that order based on how complex they are. In anatomy, when we talk about complexity or big molecules, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're really big. It just means they have a lot of Legos. So a simple molecule or a small molecule would be like a unicycle, while a complex molecule or a large molecule would be like an 18-wheeler. We'll then move into cells and their organelles, which cells, as you know, are the smallest units of life. And then we'll talk about the overall structure of cells. And then based on the DNA that's in that cell and how the cell uses that DNA, that cell will have a certain job. And when cells with similar jobs work together, that's what gives you your tissues. By definition, tissues are groups of cells with a common function. And you'll see in the human body, there's only 4 categories of tissues. Epithelial tissue, which is what makes up the coverings and membranes of our body. Muscle tissue, which is used for movement. Nervous tissue, which is used for communication. And then connective tissue, which is kind of the hodgepodge, is the leftover. It literally and figuratively connects the parts of your body together. And so at that point in time, we'll be going over the organ systems. So like I said, I tend to do gross anatomy. So once we get through chemistry and the parts of the cell, and we'll do mitosis and meiosis, and we'll talk about DNA and RNA again. We'll then move into tissues, and then we'll do the skeletal system, muscular system, digestive system, reproductive system, cardiovascular system, nervous system, lymphatic system, immune system, endocrine system. So we have to get to the small stuff first, because if I just start talking about the heart, it's not going to make sense, all the tissues and parts and why the heart is different from the stomach. So again, with the levels of structural organization, remember we start with an atom, and atoms work together to form molecules. And then the molecules can come together to form the organelles, which determine how that cell is going to work. And the types of cells that you have and the jobs they do determine your tissues. And then the tissues come together to work together to determine your organ. And a group of organs that work together is the organ system. And in multicellular organisms, we got ourselves an organism. Now, one of the things that is required of schools in North Carolina for any science classroom that is biology based, we have to review with you the basic life processes. This is what we call the characteristics of life. And you did this back in your biology class. And when you're in biology, you might have learned 7 characteristics of life. We just kind of combine these into, as you can see here, 6 different ones. So these are also themes that we'll talk about throughout anatomy. And so one of the things that we focus on a lot is metabolism. And by definition, metabolism are all the chemical reactions that your body does. So we have to talk about chemicals because different cells do chemical reactions differently. And depending on what chemicals that cell uses, it's going to have a different job. And depending on its job, it's going to make a different type of tissue, and that tissue is going to make the organs work a certain way. So when you see metabolism, it has nothing to do with how fast you break down food. Metabolism are the chemical reactions that occur within a cell or occur within an organism. We'll also talk about responsiveness, and that's just what the name says. It's how does your cell, how does your tissue respond to certain triggers. Obviously, all living things have the ability to move. Now that movement doesn't necessarily have to be physically getting up and moving if you think about plants. Okay? But plants have internal movement. Plants do move with the wind. Okay? Plants, but all living things have the ability to move. And so we're going to talk about muscles and how muscles cause the human body to move. All living things have the ability to grow. And we'll talk about what causes our bones to grow. We'll talk about what causes our muscles to stretch. And then we'll also talk about what's called differentiation. When you are first made, you are an embryo. We've all heard of embryos before. Well, embryos are made up of what are called stem cells. And you've probably heard of stem cells and stem cell research, but you might not have really understood what that meant. Stem cells are what we call undifferentiated cells, meaning stem cells are cells whose only job at that time is to go through cell division. They don't have jobs yet. They are what we call unspecialized. So undifferentiated and unspecialized go hand in hand. So in the first stages of being an embryo, we're just a ball of cells that's just dividing. We're making more and more and more and more and more cells. Well, eventually something kicks on and we begin to make hormones. And hormones are chemical messengers. When the brain needs to talk to your organs, it creates electricity. But when cells need to talk to each other, they create hormones. Well, in the later stages of becoming an embryo, our cells begin to make hormones and they start to talk to each other. And this is where they begin to figure out, okay, what's my job going to be? So a hormone might tell this cell, you know what, I need you to do this. And that's going to become your brain. While the hormone hits another cell and that cell goes, okay, well, I'm going to form a stomach. Well, at that point in time, the cells are specialized. They have a job. They are differentiated. And so that's just like, we're all humans, we're all the same, but we have, like, I'm a teacher. I'm a biology teacher. That's my specialty. I couldn't teach chemistry. I couldn't teach math. I couldn't teach reading. Doctors, they are specialists. There's a urologist. There's a pediatrician. There's a podiatrist. So when we talk about differentiation, we're talking about the special jobs that cells have. And all living things have the ability to reproduce. Now, reproduction does not necessarily mean the creation of new offspring, as in sexual reproduction. It can also be asexual reproduction, in which the cells reproduce in order to grow or to make new cells after some have been damaged or they've died off. We also have to talk about the scientific method. And virtually, it's really hard to get back in the lab and do experiments, but we've all done experiments before. You can do them in your house, and hopefully you'll get to do some in the classroom. But one of the things we do have to talk about in the science classroom is what we call the scientific method. And the scientific method deals with experiments. And experiments are basically a series of steps that we do in order to solve a problem. And a problem doesn't mean it's bad. A problem can just be a question that we have. And so ever since you were little, you've asked questions about nature. Like you said, why is the sky blue? Why is grass green? What makes a rainbow? Well, these are all what we call observations. You have identified a problem. You have a question. Well, for most of us, we asked why the sky was blue, and we just accepted whatever answer our moms and dad gave us, and we went on with our business. Well, somebody really wanted to know why the sky was blue. So they designed an experiment to figure out why the sky is blue, but like during sunrise and sunset, it's different colors. It's all based on the chemicals that are in the atmosphere and how light bounces and is refracted and diffracted and all that stuff. But all experiments begin with an observation. It's a question that that person comes up with. From there, if you remember, it forms what we call a hypothesis. And you guys probably grew up with a hypothesis simply being an educated guess, and that is perfectly fine. Okay. The key thing there, it's a guess. You don't know the answer to that, but it's educated, meaning you've thought about it. You've done a little bit of research. And with a hypothesis must have two parts to it. When we talk about a hypothesis, all good hypotheses have what we call an if-then statement. Sorry, it's a little messy. I'm not used to writing on my computer. But all good hypotheses must have an if-then. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to say if and then, but it's going to have two parts to it. The if part tells the reader what your experiment is going to be. The then part tells the reader what your guess is. So a very simple hypothesis. If I put my foot on the brake, then the car will stop. If I put my foot on the brake, tells the reader what my experiment is going to be. Then the car will stop, tells the reader what I expect my outcome to be. It can be something like this. Brine shrimp will hatch at a higher rate in motor oil. Well, what's my experiment? I'm going to put brine shrimp in motor oil. So that's my if part. My then part is I'm going to expect them to hatch at a higher rate. So it doesn't have to say if or then, but you have to have two parts to a hypothesis. And the picture kind of went over this one, but just a bad example, my dog Dakota is the best dog ever. First of all, I don't have a dog, but anyway. So there's no experiment there. There's no if and there's no then. Now, when you do not get a hypothesis mixed up with a theory, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But you've come up with your problem. You want to know why the sky is blue. And so you come up with your experiment and the if part, okay, this is what I'm going to do, then this is what I think is going to happen. So you actually do your experiment. And the experiment is an investigation that tests a hypothesis through a process of collecting data. Now, in order to do an experiment, you have to have two parts. You have to have a control group and you have to have an experimental group. The control group is the group you use for comparison. It's the group you leave alone. The experimental group is the group that gets what we call the independent variable. So if I'm growing plants and I want to see if a certain fertilizer works, I have to have one group of plants that I do not add that fertilizer to. I mean, I don't know how tomato plants normally grow. I don't know how an oak tree would normally grow. So you have to have a plant that you leave alone. You just let it do its natural thing. That's your control group. The experimental group is the group that you add the fertilizer to. And what you do to the experiment is called the independent variable. So where it talks about this single condition, I'm just going to put IV, independent variable. The independent variable is what I do to the experiment. I'm adding fertilizer. Or if I put my foot on the brake, then the car will stop. The independent variable, I'm putting my foot on the brake. What I'm looking to see, the data I'm looking to gather, is called the dependent variable because it depends on the experiment. So in order for a hypothesis, you have to have the if and then because it's giving you the experiment, but you have to have a control group as well. So you're going to run the experiment and you're going to gather data. And in science, there's two types of data you're going to gather. One type of data is called quantitative, and this is numerical data. So you're measuring how much the plant grew, or you're measuring temperature changes in a fish or in the water and how that affects the fish. But whenever you have numbers, that's going to be quantitative data. In anatomy, we do a lot of microscope work. We look at a lot of tissues underneath the microscope. We dissect the fetal pig. We dissect eyeball, the cow eye, the sheep's brain to see what it looks like on the inside. And we do a lot of drawings. That would be an example of qualitative data. Qualitative data are descriptions. They're drawings. So if you were to tell me that the rose bush grew 5 inches, that's quantitative data. But if you told me the rose bush grew these really pretty bright red flowers, that's qualitative data. So just depending on the science course and how you gather your data, you'll have a mixture of quantitative, you have a mixture of qualitative. But when you do an experiment, I don't know about you, I don't want to read 20 pages of somebody, just randomly writing stuff down. Things need to be organized. The saying, a picture tells 1,000 words. That's why when we analyze the data, we organize it. And we organize it into nice paragraphs, or we put in a pretty drawing, or we use graphs and data tables. Because if you just write a bunch of numbers down on a piece of paper, that's going to mean nothing to me. If you put it in a data table, I can see a pattern, and I can really see a pattern if you draw it on a graph. Well, that obviously with quantitative data, you're going to give me tables, you're going to give me graphs. But in the case of qualitative data, we're going to be doing paragraphs and illustrations. Once you do your experiment, you then look at your data and you come up with your conclusion. And the conclusion is basically, was my hypothesis supported or rejected? We never, ever, ever say a hypothesis is true or and a hypothesis is false. We never do that, okay? Because nature is always changing. You can have a car and for 20 years you put your foot on the brake and it stops. And then one day you put your foot on the brake and it doesn't stop. Okay? So we cannot say a hypothesis is proven or true or false. We just say supported or rejected. Basically what that means is after you've done your experiments and you've gathered your data, did you get the answer you thought you were going to get? Now, once you come up with your conclusion, you then have to go to step 7, which is retest and submit. This is one of the reasons why, for example, it's taking a long time to get a COVID vaccine, because we have to test it and retest it and retest it. We have to come up with all these different variables, all these different scenarios. Does it work no matter what? So it takes a little while were our results consistent, or do I need more data? Now, at this point in time, this is where this thing called a theory comes into play. Remember, hypothesis is an educated guess. It's what you want to start with. Well, a theory is basically a hypothesis that has been supported a number of times. So you've done this experiment over and over and over again, and you always got the same answer. And other scientists did your experiments over and over and over again, and you always got the same answer. At that point in time, it can be considered a theory, like Newton's, or like the theory of natural selection, or there's certain theories in chemistry that deal with gases. But a theory does not mean it is proven. It just means that nature tends to give me the same answer every time. So a theory is a hypothesis that has been tested over and over and over again with the same results. But nature can still at some point in time come in and mess it up. The only things that are considered proven are laws. And most laws are mathematically based. And so no matter where in the universe you go, it's still going to be true. So like I mentioned with Unit 1, this is just going to be an intro to concepts that we're going to talk about all year. In the next video that I'm going to be going over, we're going to be looking at a few chemistry terms that we're going to be seeing a lot and things called negative and positive feedback mechanisms. So until next time, stay safe, have fun, work hard.